The RV dealer's lot was quiet on a Tuesday morning in early August, and Frank Sutter was the only salesman who didn't try to shake my hand before I'd finished reading the window sticker. That was the first thing I noticed about him. The second thing I noticed was that the Tiffin Allegro, 32 feet at the far end of the lot, had the same exterior color, a warm sandstone with a thin copper stripe along the roofline, as the one Elaine had circled in the brochure she'd printed from the manufacturer's website 3 years ago. She had folded the top right corner of that page. The fold was still crisp. I had taken the brochure from the third drawer of her nightstand the morning I drove to the dealership, and it was sitting on the passenger seat of my truck when I signed the purchase agreement. I am 64 years old. I spent 41 years as a civil engineer, bridges, drainage systems, load-bearing calculations. The work taught me two things that have stayed useful long after retirement: how to read a structure before it fails, and how to recognize when someone is telling you what a system can do rather than what it will do under stress. I thought about both of those things later. I didn't think about them yet. Elaine had passed away 14 months before that August morning. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had been married 38 years. The RV trip Pacific Coast Highway in September, then down through the California missions, then east toward the desert in October when the heat broke, had been her idea first, then mine, then ours together in the way that good ideas become shared property after enough years. We had watched videos about the Tiffin on her laptop in bed on Sunday evenings. She had opinions about storage capacity and slide-out configurations and the turning radius on narrow coastal roads. She had researched campgrounds from Crescent City to San Diego and kept a notebook with her notes organized by region. The notebook was still in the same drawer as the brochure. I had not opened it since March. Frank walked me through the vehicle without rushing. He knew what he was talking about and didn't pretend to know things he didn't. When I asked about the chassis warranty and the generator service interval, he gave me specific answers and wrote the numbers down on a notepad without being asked. We were standing near the driver's side door when he asked the question that had nothing to do with the vehicle. "Is your family supportive of the trip?" I looked at him. He wasn't being intrusive. His voice had the flat, careful tone of someone who has asked the same question many times for a practical reason. "Why do you ask?" He said he'd been selling RVs for 16 years. He said that in the last several years, he had watched a pattern develop. An older customer would come in alone, purchase a vehicle outright, and within 3 to 6 months, a family member, usually an adult child or a spouse of one, would contact him asking about the sale price, the financing terms, whether the buyer had seemed oriented. He said he'd had one customer, a retired postal worker from Fresno, whose daughter had used the RV purchase as part of a conservatorship filing. He said it carefully. He wasn't telling me I was in danger. He was telling me what he'd seen. "I keep copies of everything in 3 places," he said. "I'd suggest you do the same. Title, purchase agreement, insurance documents, 1 at home, 1 with your attorney, and 1 in the glove compartment of the vehicle itself." He paused. People forget about the glove compartment. I told him I'd remember that. He handed me the keys, and I signed where his assistant indicated, and I drove the Tiffin home on the highway with the windows down and the radio off. It handled well on the merge. Daniel called that evening. My son is 41, an accountant with a firm in Sacramento, and his voice on the phone has a particular quality when he is concerned about something that is also, in some secondary way, about money. I've known him for 41 years, and I know the difference between his worried voice and his calculating voice. That evening, I wasn't entirely sure which one I was hearing. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. He asked what I'd been up to, and I told him I'd made a purchase. He asked what kind of purchase. I told him I'd bought the RV Elaine, and I had talked about. There was a pause. Then he asked what it had cost. I told him that I was planning to drive the coast in September, that the weather was usually good along the northern stretch through the middle of the month, that I'd been looking at a campground near Bodega Bay that had good reviews. He asked again about the price. I told him I was looking forward to the trip, We talked for another 4 minutes about nothing in particular, and then we said goodnight. Brianna called the following afternoon. My daughter-in-law has a voice that is almost always pleasant-measured and warm in a way that took me a long time to understand was not the same as being kind. She said she'd talked to Daniel and that she was worried about me. She said that losing Elaine had been a profound loss and that she wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself. She said the word profound twice. She asked if I had considered speaking with a grief counselor because she had heard wonderful things about a practice in my area, and she could send me the name if I wanted. Then she said that she and Daniel had been thinking about my finances not intruding. She said, just thinking, and that if I ever wanted help managing things during this period, they were happy to assist. She said, this period, the way people say it, when they mean something longer than a period. She said she just wanted to make sure I wasn't making any decisions I might regret. I told her I appreciated the thought. I told her I'd let her know if I needed anything. She said, of course, and that she loved me. And we hung up. She sounded genuinely concerned. I want to be honest about that. If I had heard that conversation without knowing what came before it, I might have thought here is a woman who cares about her father-in-law. The concern was coherent. The offer was framed reasonably. I had no evidence yet of anything other than a daughter-in-law who was perhaps a little too interested in my financial decisions. But I knew what had come before it. The day of Elaine's funeral. I had returned from the graveside service still wearing my coat. The house was full of neighbors, old colleagues, Elaine's sister from Portland. I had been standing in the kitchen when Brianna found me. She had touched my arm and said she was sorry, that Elaine had been a wonderful woman. Then she asked whether the estate had gone through probate yet, and whether Daniel was named in the will. Not whether I was all right, not whether I needed to sit down, whether the will had been filed. I had not answered her. I had looked at her for a moment, and then someone else had come into the kitchen, and the conversation had ended. I thought about that question for the rest of that week. I turned it over the way I used to turn over load calculations looking for the assumption underneath the assumption. 40 years of engineering teaches you that the first crack you see is rarely the first crack that formed. I thought about Frank Sutter's 16 years of watching the same pattern develop. I thought about the word period. On the Monday of the following week, I called Margaret Osey. I had been referred to her 3 years earlier when Elaine and I had updated our wills. Margaret had been practicing elder law for 28 years, and she had the particular quality of a person who has seen most things and is therefore not alarmed by them, only precise. I told her what Brianna had asked at the funeral. I told her about the phone call. I told her about the RV. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said she'd like to schedule a meeting. I told her I had some documents to bring her. She said good. I put the Tiffin's purchase agreement in the fireproof box in my closet. I scanned a copy and emailed it to Margaret's office, and I took the third copy along with the title, the insurance card, and a document Margaret would help me prepare in the weeks that followed, and I put it in the glove compartment of the RV, exactly where Frank Sutter had suggested. Then I went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Elaine's brochure in front of me. The fold on the corner of the page was still sharp. September was 5 weeks away. The first time Brianna came to see the RV, she brought a casserole. That detail stayed with me. Not the visit itself, not what she said, the casserole. It was in a glass dish with a lid, the kind of thing you bring when you want to appear thoughtful without spending much effort. She set it on my kitchen counter and said she'd made too much for just the two of them. And she knew I hadn't been eating properly since Elaine. That last part was true. I hadn't. But she said it the way you'd say something you'd rehearsed, landing it at the right moment to establish the right impression. I noticed the timing. I let it pass. It was 2 weeks after I'd signed the papers on the Tiffin. Daniel and Brianna had come over on a Saturday afternoon, a casual visit. They said, just checking in. I was at the kitchen table with a legal pad, working through my route for the first trip. I'd been planning to leave the 3rd week of September, take the Blue Ridge Parkway south, then loop through the Smokies before turning west. I had the atlas open to Virginia. Elaine had always liked atlases. She didn't trust GPS the way I did. She said she needed to see the whole picture at once. Brianna looked over my shoulder at the legal pad. She said, "Oh, are you planning your first trip already?" I said I was. She sat down across from me. Daniel stayed standing near the window, the way he does when he's not sure what to do with his hands. Brianna said she was glad I was feeling better, and then she said she had a thought, not a demand. Just a thought that she and Daniel had been talking about a family trip before summer ended. Her sister's kids were getting older, and the cousins didn't spend enough time together, and it would mean so much to everyone if they could use the RV for a long weekend. She said it would give me time to rest, which I needed. She said she knew how exhausted I must be, still grieving, still adjusting. She said the words with her hands folded on the table, her voice pitched just low enough to sound like concern. I looked at Daniel. He was studying the window frame. I said I appreciated the thought, but I'd already committed to my September dates, and I wasn't comfortable lending the RV before I'd even driven it myself. I said it without apology. Brianna nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not accepting what you've said, but filing it away for later. She said of course. She completely understood. They could talk about it another time. Daniel said nothing. They left an hour later. I ate the casserole for dinner. It was oversalted. A month passed. I had the RV serviced, replaced the wiper blades, stocked the storage bays with the gear I'd been collecting since January. I drove it twice around the county just to feel how it handled on the highway ramps. It handled well. The September trip was 5 weeks out. Daniel called on a Tuesday evening. I was reading on the back porch. He started with small talk work, was busy. The weather had been strange. He'd been meaning to call. Then he said he and Brianna had been talking, and they were a little worried. I asked what about. He said they'd noticed some things. He used the phrase cognitive decline in the third sentence. He said it carefully, like he was reading it from somewhere. He said the RV purchase had seemed impulsive, that the amount of money I'd spent in the past few months was unusual for me, and that they just wanted to make sure I was okay. He said cognitive decline again. And then, underneath his voice, faint but distinct, I heard Brianna's voice, a low murmur, a word or two, coaching from somewhere just off the line. Daniel paused. I let the pause sit for a moment. I asked him if he'd like to come for dinner on Sunday. He said they were busy. I said all right, and that I'd talk to him soon, and I hung up. I sat on the porch for another 20 minutes. The light was going amber over the back fence, the same way it went amber in late August every year, and I thought about the phrase he'd used. Cognitive decline. It's a clinical term. Daniel is a numbers man. He doesn't reach for clinical terms on his own. He reaches for spreadsheets and quarterly projections. Someone had handed him that phrase and told him where to put it. I went inside and wrote down the date and time of the call and what had been said. I put it in the folder I'd started keeping in my desk drawer. 6 weeks after I'd bought the RV, I opened my email on a Wednesday morning and found a message from Brianna's address. The subject line read, Family Support Plan Follow-Up Discussion. I read it twice before I did anything else. It was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph said she was writing out of love and concern. The second paragraph outlined what she described as a family support framework for managing my finances and day-to-day decisions during what she called my adjustment period following Elaine's passing. The third paragraph contained a specific request that I sign a durable power of attorney, granting Daniel authority over my financial accounts, effective immediately. She noted that this was standard practice for aging individuals managing significant assets alone. She used the phrase elder financial vulnerability twice. Attached to the email was a PDF, a news article about seniors being defrauded by outside parties, titled Protecting Our Elders' Warning Signs. Families Must Know. The article had nothing to do with me. It was meant to create a frame. I recognized the technique. I'd seen it used in contract disputes. Establish a threat. Position yourself as the solution. The fourth paragraph said she looked forward to discussing this at my earliest convenience, and that Daniel was fully supportive. I printed the email. I printed the attachment. I put them in the folder. Then I called Margaret O'Sea's office and asked if she had time to meet that week. She did. I brought the folder to her office on Friday. Margaret had been practicing elder law for 28 years, and her office looked like it 2 walls of shelves, a desk that had seen serious work, a window that faced the parking lot and apparently didn't bother her. She read through everything without speaking. The call log, the email, the attachment. She read the subject line twice. When she finished, she set the folder down and looked at me over her reading glasses. She said, "They're building a file." I asked what she meant. She said the pattern was deliberate. First contact framed as concern, the visit, the casserole, the offer to help. Second contact introducing the language of incapacity, cognitive decline, the suggestion of unusual spending. Third contact formalizing the claim with a document request and supporting material. She said each step was designed to create a record. If I'd signed the power of attorney, that record would have shown a pattern of voluntary compliance. If I'd refused and they escalated, the record would show escalating concern from family members who had tried to help. She said, "The next step won't be an email." I asked how long. She said, "Not long." I asked her what we should do. She opened her desk drawer and took out a legal pad. She said, "You've already done most of it. Now we document what you have, and we make sure everything is exactly where it needs to be." She asked about the RV title. I told her it was in the glove compartment. She asked about the purchase agreement. I told her it was in my fireproof box and she had a scanned copy. She nodded. She said there was one more thing she wanted me to consider not urgent, but worth thinking about. I told her I was listening. She said she'd explain it at our next meeting. Once she'd had time to draft the language properly, she said it would make the glove compartment document considerably more useful if things went the way she thought they might. I drove home the long way, past the county fairgrounds, past the road that used to have the drive-in before they tore it down in 1998. Elaine and I had seen 3 movies at that drive-in. I couldn't remember which 3. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks later. Daniel and Brianna came. I cooked the turkey the way Elaine had always done it, with the herb butter under the skin. The timing written on a note card in her handwriting that I kept in the kitchen drawer. Brianna brought a salad and a bottle of wine she'd clearly chosen carefully. She was pleasant all evening. She helped clear the plates. She asked about my September trip with what sounded like genuine interest, and I told her it had gone well, and she said that was wonderful. Daniel sat across from me at the table. At one point, I asked him how the new project at work was coming a municipal audit he'd mentioned in September. He gave me 2 sentences and looked at his plate. I asked if they were planning to travel for Christmas. He said they hadn't decided. He didn't look up when he answered. I watched him cut his turkey into small pieces he wasn't eating, and I remembered Daniel at 12 years old, sitting at this same table, telling me he hadn't gotten his history test back yet when I already knew from his teacher that he'd failed it. He'd cut his food into small pieces then, too. He wasn't a dishonest person by nature. He never had been. He was a person who had convinced himself, or been convinced, that what he was doing was necessary, that it was for someone's good, that the discomfort he felt was just the cost of doing the right thing. I didn't say anything about it. I passed him the rolls and asked if he wanted more turkey. He said no, thank you. After they left, I washed the dishes and put Elaine's note card back in the drawer. I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The RV was parked in the side yard, visible from where I stood, the white hull of it catching the last of the November light. I went to my desk and opened the folder. I added a note about Thanksgiving. Then I called Margaret's voicemail and left a message saying I was ready for the next meeting whenever she had time. The call came at 7:40 in the morning. I was at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee when my phone rang, Walt Deering's number on the screen. But before that, at 7:22, Daniel had called. I almost didn't answer. I had seen his name on the screen and thought this is early. And early calls from Daniel in the past several months had not been simple things. But I answered. Because I had always answered. Because that is what you do when your son calls. His voice was careful in a way that told me he had been rehearsing. He said he wanted to talk before things got complicated. He said he and Brianna had been thinking seriously about my well-being, and that they had consulted with a professional, he did not say who had confirmed that what they were planning was the responsible course of action. He said the RV represented a real financial risk for someone in my position. He said my position without defining it. He said they were doing this because they cared about me, and that I should understand it came from a place of love. Every sentence was correct. Every sentence was hers. I had heard Brianna use the phrase responsible course of action in the email she had sent 3 weeks earlier. I had heard her use someone in your position at the dinner with Renee and Greg. The syntax was the same. The rhythm was the same. Daniel had always been a precise man with language. He chose words carefully when they were his own. These were not his own. I said, "Daniel, whose idea was this call?" A pause. 3 seconds. "I wanted to talk to you," he said. "I know," I said. "Whose idea was it?" Another pause. Longer. I let it sit. I had learned, over the past several months, that silence was the most useful thing I had. People fill silence with what they actually mean. Daniel said, "She thought it would be better if I called first, so you'd understand." I said I understood. I said I appreciated him calling. I said I'd talk to him soon. I set the phone down on the table and looked at my coffee. It had gone cold while we talked. I drank it anyway. 15 minutes later, Walt Deering's number appeared on the screen. Walt lives directly across the street. He's been there 19 years, the same as me, and he has the particular habit of early risers. He notices things. He told me there was a car parked in front of my house that he didn't recognize at first. Then did Daniel's gray Accord, the one with the dent on the rear quarter panel from last winter. He said Daniel had been sitting in it for about 20 minutes without getting out. Just sitting. Walt had watched from his front window while he drank his coffee. He gave me the license plate number anyway, even though I already knew it. That was Walt Thorough. I thanked him and told him to have a good morning. I set the phone down on the table and looked out of the kitchen window toward the street. The Accord was still there. I could see the shape of Daniel in the driver's seat, not moving. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. There are moments when you know something is about to happen, and the knowing doesn't change anything. You can't stop it, and you don't try to. You just watch it come. I had been watching this particular thing come for several months. I had the folder in my desk. I had Margaret's number memorized. I had done what I could do in advance, and now the rest of it was going to happen on its own schedule, not mine. I heard the front door open at 7:58. I had changed the main locks in September. New deadbolt, new handle set, new keys. What I had not changed was the spare key to the RV. It had always hung on a hook in the hallway near the coat rack, on a yellow keychain Elaine had bought at a hardware store years ago because she said yellow was easy to find in the dark. I had moved it 2 weeks ago, put it in the kitchen junk drawer under a takeout menu and a dead flashlight. I had told myself I would get to the RV locks next. I hadn't gotten there yet. Brianna came in first. Daniel followed. He was wearing his gray jacket, the one with the deep side pockets, and his hands were already in them. Brianna didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at me the way a person looks at something they've already decided belongs to them. She said they hadn't come to discuss anything. She used the word discuss with a particular emphasis. As if prior conversations had been a courtesy they were no longer extending. She said they were there because the situation needed to be resolved, and they were resolving it. I asked what situation she meant. She said the RV. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and set a key on the kitchen table. Yellow keychain. He didn't look at me when he put it down. I looked at the key. Then I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the wall to my left, the spot where Elaine's calendar used to hang before I took it down in the spring. If you're listening to this and you've ever watched someone you raised do something they know is wrong and do it anyway, if you know that particular silence, then you understand why I didn't say anything right then. I just want you to know that I saw his face. I'm still thinking about his face. Brianna said they were taking the RV for storage because it was a depreciating asset sitting in the yard, and that was irresponsible. She said it was for my benefit. She said a lot of things in a short amount of time, and all of them were organized and rehearsed, and none of them were true in the way she meant them. I asked how they had gotten into the house. She said Daniel still had a key. I said I had changed the locks. She said they had been by the previous week when I wasn't home. She said the kitchen window latch was loose. She said it the way you say something that isn't quite an admission and isn't quite a lie, just information, offered neutrally, waiting to see what you do with it. I didn't do anything with it, not then. Daniel picked up the yellow keychain from the table and they walked out. I heard the RV engine turn over through the kitchen window, that particular diesel sound I had learned to recognize over the past year, low and steady. The way Elaine had liked it. She said it sounded purposeful. I heard it back out of the side yard and onto the street. Then it was gone. I called 911 at 8:14. Officer Trevino arrived at 8:26. He was younger than I expected, late 20s, maybe 30, with the careful manner of someone who has learned to be neutral in domestic situations. He walked through the kitchen with me. I showed him the junk drawer open, the takeout menu pushed to one side, the dead flashlight still there, the space where the key had been. He photographed it with his phone. He asked me several questions and wrote the answers in a small notebook. Then he explained the situation. He said that because Daniel had possessed a key, regardless of how he had obtained it, and because Daniel had stated he had permission, this was a civil matter. He said the word civil without apology. The way people say things that are technically accurate and practically useless at the same time. He said he could file a report, which would document that the key was taken and the vehicle removed, but he could not compel the vehicle's return without a court order. He said if I wanted to pursue it, I should contact an attorney. I told him I already had one. He nodded. He finished writing. He printed a copy of the incident report from a small device on his belt and handed it to me. I signed my name at the bottom and kept the copy. Officer Trevino shook my hand and left. I watched his cruiser pull away from the curb. The house was very quiet. I went to the living room. On the mantel above the fireplace, between a small wooden clock and a river stone Daniel had brought back from a camping trip when he was 11, there was a photograph in a silver frame. Elaine and I standing in a parking lot outside a dealership. She was pointing at the front window of the RV. In the catalog, she was holding the actual brochure, the one she'd folded and carried in her purse for 3 months before I finally called the dealer. She was laughing at something I'd said. I don't remember what I said. I remember her laughing. I stood there for a moment. I didn't say anything to the photograph. There wasn't anything to say. Then I called Margaret. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what had happened, Walt's call, Daniel in the car, the kitchen window, the key on the table, Officer Trevino, the civil matter, the incident report in my hand. I told her all of it, in the order it happened. Without editorializing, Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence on her end. I counted it. 4 seconds. She said, "Good. This is exactly what we needed." She told me that the incident report established the timeline. The photograph of the empty drawer established that the key had been stored separately, not on the hook, not in plain sight, not left casually accessible. The fact that they had entered through the kitchen window the previous week, which Brianna had disclosed voluntarily in my presence, would be relevant. All of it went into the record. Then she told me what to send. 1 sentence. She said, nothing more. No explanation, no accusation, no demand. 1 sentence. And then, nothing, no follow-up. No response to whatever he sent back. She told me what the sentence was. She had been waiting for the right moment to use it, and this was it. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down at the table where the yellow keychain had been sitting 20 minutes earlier. I opened the message thread with Daniel. The last exchange was from 3 weeks ago. Something about Thanksgiving leftovers. Ordinary and small. I thought about him sitting in that car for 20 minutes before coming inside. I thought about what a person thinks about during 20 minutes like that, whether he had been trying to talk himself into it, or out of it, or whether he had already decided and was just waiting for the nerve. I thought about the way he had set the key on the table without looking at me. I typed the message. 7 words. I read it once. Then I sent it. Check the glove compartment before you go further. I set the phone down on the table. Outside, the side yard was empty. The rectangle of flattened grass where the RV had been parked was still visible, a pale outline, like a shadow that had forgotten to leave. I looked at it for a while. Then I got up, rinsed my coffee cup, and went to my desk to add to the folder. The phone rang at 9:14 in the evening. I had been sitting at my desk for the better part of an hour, adding to the folder Margaret had asked me to maintain dates, times, descriptions, anything that could be documented. I had filled 11 pages since Elaine's funeral. I picked up before the second ring. Daniel's voice was different, not the flat, careful voice he had been using for the past several months, the voice that sounded like someone reading from a script he hadn't written. This was something else, thinner, like a man who had just opened a door he hadn't expected to find unlocked. He said, "What does that letter mean? And what is all of this?" I had been waiting for exactly that question, not hoping for it waiting. There is a difference. "Tell me what you're looking at," I said. A pause. I heard him moving the sound of paper, something being lifted and set down. "There's a letter," he said, "notarized. It says it was prepared by an attorney named Margaret Osei and filed with the county clerk. It establishes sole ownership of the vehicle." He paused again. "It's dated 4 months ago." "Dad, 4 months." "Keep going," I said. "There's a copy of the title, the registration, the insurance card, and there's—" Another pause, longer this time. "There's a GPS log. It shows every trip the vehicle has taken since purchase, every date, every location, every distance. It shows the vehicle leaving this address this morning at 8:47. I let that sit for a moment. Outside, the side yard was empty. The pale rectangle in the grass where the RV had stood was invisible now, swallowed by the evening. "The log was Margaret's idea," I said. "She had me install the tracker in January. Every trip is time-stamped and stored in a server she has access to. The one from this morning is already in the record." 11 seconds of silence. I counted them. I have spent enough years on job sites where silence costs money to know how long 11 seconds actually is. It is long enough for a man to understand that something has changed, even if he doesn't yet know exactly what. "Who else has seen this?" he said. "Margaret called Officer Trevino 8 minutes before I sent you that message," I said. She explained that the RV contains a legally notarized letter establishing my sole ownership of the vehicle title, registration, insurance, everything in my name only. She explained that the key was taken from the kitchen drawer, not the hook by the front door. That distinction matters. Daniel, taking a key from a hook in a common area is one thing. Going into a kitchen drawer is something else. She used the phrase breaking and entering. Trevino wrote it down, and the GPS log is now attached to his incident report. The silence on his end was different this time, not the silence of a man calculating, the silence of a man who has just understood that every move he made today was already documented before he made it. "Brianna said you'd want us to use it," he said finally. His voice had changed again, quieter, slower, the rehearsed quality gone entirely. "She said you'd told her—" "I know what she said." I kept my voice level. I had decided months ago that I would not raise my voice when this moment came, not because I wasn't angry. I was, in the way that runs too deep for volume, but because a raised voice is the one thing that could make this look like a family argument instead of what it actually was. Bring the RV back before 10 o'clock tonight. That's all I'm asking right now. Does Brianna have to apologize? I looked at the window. Bring the vehicle home tonight, I said. We'll talk after that. Dad. Before 10, Daniel. I ended the call and set the phone on the desk. Then I opened the folder to a fresh page and wrote down the time, 9:14 p.m. Call from Daniel. I-10 approximately 31 miles east based on the timing. Mentioned Brianna's justification. Agreed to return vehicle. I wrote it in the same deliberate hand I had used for 40 years on engineering documents, the habit of a man who learned early that the difference between a record and a memory is that one of them holds up in court. I had not always been this careful. There was a version of me, years ago, who would have driven out to I-10 himself and said things he couldn't take back. Elaine used to say I had two speeds, Stillwater and flash flood, and that I had spent most of our marriage learning to stay at Stillwater. She was right. She was right about most things. I thought about her as I wrote, the way I thought about her during most quiet moments now, not with the sharp grief of the first months, but with something more, like the ache of a healed fracture on a cold morning. Present, permanent, mine. The brochure was still on the corner of the desk, where I had placed it the day I brought the RV home. Rocky Mountain National Park, Yellowstone, the Pacific Coast Highway, her handwriting in the margins, small, neat circles around the things she had wanted to see. I had not moved it. I was not ready to move it. At 9:47 p.m. I heard the low groan of the RV's engine on the street. I stood at the front window and watched it pull into the driveway slowly, carefully. The way you handle something you're not sure you should have taken in the first place. Daniel sat behind the wheel for perhaps 30 seconds after the engine went off. I could see the shape of him through the windshield, not moving. Then the driver's door opened. He stepped out, walked to the front door, and crouched down. I heard the soft scrape of metal on the welcome mat. Then his footsteps back to his car. He did not knock. He did not look up at the window. His headlights came on, backed out into the street, and were gone by the time they reached the corner. I waited another minute before I opened the front door. The key was there, sitting on the center of the welcome mat, the one Elaine had bought at a garden show in 2019, the one with the faded botanical print that I kept meaning to replace, and never did. I picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked, the way objects sometimes are when you understand what they represent. I stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the night air, and then I went inside. The kitchen was quiet. I put the kettle on and sat down at the table. The tea went cold before I drank it. I noticed that and drank it anyway. Margaret had told me 3 weeks earlier in her office on the 4th floor of the Halstead building, a woman who has practiced elder law for 28 years develops a particular directness that if they escalated to using the key, the next move would almost certainly be the courts. Not a confrontation, not an argument. The courts. She had said it without drama, the way she said most things, setting a manila folder on the desk and folding her hands on top of it. Raymond, people who take keys don't stop at keys. They stop at whatever stops them. She had looked at me over her reading glasses. Is there anything in your preparation we haven't covered? I had told her there wasn't. That had been true then. It was still true now. I had started building the folder 6 months before the night Brianna took the key from the kitchen drawer. Not because I had known exactly what would happen, I hadn't, but because I had spent enough years on construction projects to understand that the time to prepare the documentation is before you need it, not after. You survey the site before you break ground. You file the permits before you pour the foundation. You do not wait for the structure to be failing before you decide what it was supposed to hold. The folder now had 43 pages, dates, times, conversations, photographs of the RV's title and registration, a copy of the notarized ownership letter that Margaret had prepared and that was currently sitting in the RV's glove compartment in a sealed envelope, a copy of Officer Trevino's log from earlier that evening, the text message, screenshot and printed, all of it organized by date, all of it cross-referenced. Margaret had reviewed it twice. She had said, both times, that it was the most thorough personal documentation she had seen from a client in years. I had not taken that as a compliment. Exactly. I had taken it as confirmation that I had been paying attention. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the tea was gone. The house was the particular quiet of a house that has held more people than it currently holds. I had lived in it for 31 years. I knew every sound it made the expansion of the floorboards in the hallway when the heat came on, the faint rattle of the kitchen window in a north wind, the way the refrigerator cycled every 22 minutes with a sound like a slow exhale. Elaine had known those sounds too. Some nights, in the first months after she was gone, I would hear one of them and wait for her to say something about it from the other room before I remembered. I did not wait tonight. I got up, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light. Before I went to bed, I checked that the RV key was on the hook by the front door, not the kitchen drawer, the hook, and I added one more line to the folder. 9:47 p.m. Vehicle returned. Key left on mat. Daniel did not make contact. Then, below that, in smaller letters, tomorrow, I call Margaret. I already knew what she would say. I had known for 6 months. The certified mail arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after Daniel left the RV key on the front mat without knocking. I was in the kitchen when I heard the postal truck. Walt Deering was already outside, running his mower along the fence line between our properties. He did that every Tuesday in the warm months, had done it for as long as I could remember. I walked to the end of the driveway and signed for the envelope while Walt cut the engine and watched from 20 feet away. He didn't say anything. He could see the return address from where he was standing. It was a law firm I didn't recognize, out of a city 40 minutes east of here. I stood at the end of the driveway and read the first 2 pages before I went back inside. Walt restarted the mower. I noted the time, 10:14 a.m., and the date, and the fact that Walt had been present, and I added it to the folder before I called Margaret. The petition was for guardianship and conservatorship. The grounds were cognitive decline. The evidence, as listed in the filing, was a single-line item, the purchase of a recreational vehicle valued at $94,000, described as a significant and uncharacteristic financial decision inconsistent with the subject's prior spending patterns, 41 years of engineering, 32 years of home ownership, and a marriage that had outlasted most of what I'd built professionally, and the entire argument rested on one purchase that Brianna had watched me make with her own eyes and said nothing about at the time. Margaret's office was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and good coffee. She had been practicing elder law for 28 years, and her desk looked like it. She read the petition without expression, then set it down and looked at me. "How long do you think she's been preparing this?" she asked. I told her I'd been thinking about that since I opened the envelope. The family support plan email, the one Brianna had sent 3 weeks before she and Daniel took the RV. I had read it twice when it arrived, and something about the language had felt off. Not wrong. Exactly. Careful. The kind of careful that comes from revision, not from the first draft of a concerned daughter-in-law. Every sentence documented an attempt to help. Every paragraph established a record of family intervention. I had kept the email because I kept everything, but standing at the end of my driveway that Tuesday morning, I understood what it had actually been for. She needed a paper trail showing the family tried, I said. The email was to create evidence. Taking the RV was to create a crisis. She needed me to react badly, call the police, and make a scene, or refuse to engage and look uncooperative, or get upset enough that someone could describe me as erratic. Margaret nodded slowly. "And you didn't. I sent one text message and called you." She picked up her pen. "Then we build from there." What we built over the next 3 weeks was a document that I suspected Brianna had not anticipated. Margaret requested 12 years of financial records, not a summary. The full history and what they showed was a pattern so consistent it was almost boring. Conservative allocation, no impulsive shift, no unexplained withdrawals. I had not made a significant financial decision without documentation since Elaine and I refinanced the house in 2009. The RV purchased, when placed inside that 12-year context, represented 11% of my liquid assets. Margaret's financial consultant, a woman named Diane who had done expert witness work for 15 years, put that number in writing. My physician, Dr. Anand Mehta, had been my doctor for 9 years. He agreed to provide a formal statement. He had seen me 6 weeks before the petition was filed, a routine appointment. Nothing flagged. His statement was 4 paragraphs and did not hedge. Margaret read it once and said, "Good." That was how I knew it was very good. Walt came in on a Thursday afternoon and sat across from Margaret's paralegal for 45 minutes. He gave a signed statement describing what he had observed on the morning of the RV incident, the time, the circumstances, what he had seen Daniel and Brianna do, and what he had seen me do. He also described the Tuesday the certified mail arrived, the time, the return address visible from 20 feet, the fact that I had read the documents at the end of the driveway before going inside. He signed it without being asked to change a word. "He's a good neighbor," Margaret said, after he left. 19 years, I said. She wrote something in the margin of her notes. Jury's like 19 years. 2 weeks before Daniel called, Brianna organized what she described in her text message as a family check-in dinner at their house. She said she had invited her sister Renee and Renee's husband Greg, and that she thought it would be good for everyone to spend time together. She said it would be good for me specifically. I went because Daniel had asked me to come, and because I had learned, by then, that declining things gives people more material to work with than attending them does. Renee and Greg were already there when I arrived. I had met them perhaps 4 times over the years, pleasant enough people who had never shown particular interest in me, one way or another. We sat in Brianna and Daniel's dining room. Brianna had made pasta. She poured wine I didn't ask for. Halfway through the meal, Brianna said, addressing the table rather than me, that she was so glad I was getting out of the house more because she knew how isolating it could be for someone in my situation. She said, "my situation," the way a doctor says it in a waiting room, a phrase designed to sound clinical and caring at the same time, to make the person it describes feel simultaneously managed and grateful. Renee nodded sympathetically and said, "It must be so hard to be alone at my age." Greg said he'd read somewhere that social isolation was one of the leading predictors of cognitive decline in older adults. I looked at Daniel. He was cutting his pasta into pieces he was not eating. Brianna said she had been doing a lot of research on resources available for seniors managing significant assets independently, and that she wanted to share some of what she'd found because she knew how overwhelming these things could be. She had printed something, a pamphlet, it looked like, and she set it on the table beside my plate without looking at me directly. She said she just wanted me to know that there was help available and that no one expected me to manage everything alone. The pamphlet was titled Financial Planning for Older Adults Protecting What You've Built. It had a photograph on the cover of an elderly man sitting alone at a kitchen table, looking at papers. I picked it up. I read the title. I set it back down. No one at the table said anything for a moment. Then Renee asked if I had thought about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere with more of a community. She said it in the gentle tone of a person who believes she is being kind. I said I was comfortable where I was. I said it pleasantly, without apology, the way I had learned to say things in rooms like that one. Brianna smiled and said, Of course. She just wanted me to know the options existed. She refilled my wine glass without asking. I drove home at 9 o'clock. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Then I went to my desk, opened the folder, and wrote down the date, the time, the names of everyone present, and what had been said. I wrote down the title of the pamphlet. I wrote down the phrase Greg had used, leading predictors of cognitive decline, and noted that it was the same phrase Daniel had used on the phone 2 months earlier. Same phrase, different mouth. I underlined it. Then I called Margaret's voicemail and read her the note. The call from Daniel came on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after the petition arrived. It was the first time I had heard his voice since the night he left the key on the mat. He sounded tired in the way that people sound when they have been arguing for a long time and have stopped expecting to win. He said he didn't want to do this. He said Brianna had explained that it was the only way to protect the family's financial interests. He said the word protect twice. I noticed that. Whose financial interests? Daniel, I asked. The line was quiet for a moment. I could hear something in the background, a television or a radio, turned low. Dad, I'm not asking to be difficult. I want to know whose interests you're describing. He didn't answer that question. He said something about how things had gotten complicated, how he hadn't meant for it to go this far. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I asked him one more time, quietly, whose assets are we protecting? Daniel. The silence lasted long enough that I counted it. 7 seconds. I told him I hoped he would think carefully about what he was being asked to do and who he was being asked to do it for. Then I said goodnight and ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, not doing anything in particular. The refrigerator ran its cycle. I got up and added a note to the folder. Daniel called, 6:43 p.m., said he didn't want to proceed, did not say he would stop. That distinction mattered. I wrote it down because distinctions always matter and because Margaret had told me to document everything, but also because I had been an engineer for long enough to know that the difference between what a person says and what a person does is where the real information lives. The night before the hearing, I went out to the RV. It was parked in the side lot, where it had been since Daniel brought it back. The evening was cool and the lot was quiet. I unlocked the door, stepped up, and sat in the driver's seat for the first time since I had driven it home from Frank Sutter's lot 14 months ago. It still smelled like new upholstery and something faintly chemical, the sealer on the countertop, maybe, or the carpet adhesive. Elaine would have opened every window and complained about it cheerfully for the first 200 miles. I had thought about that when I bought it. I had thought about it more than once since. I reached over and opened the glove compartment. The documents were still there. The registration, the insurance card, the notarized letter, the GPS log printout that Margaret had helped me prepare. All of it, in order, exactly as I had placed it. I did not take anything out. I had read every page enough times that I no longer needed to. I sat there for a while. The parking lot light came on at the edge of the property, a motion sensor, triggered by something I couldn't see. It went off again after a minute. Through the windshield, I could see the roofline of the house, and past it, the edge of the tree line where the yard ended. Elaine had wanted to plant something along that line. She had a name for what she wanted, something with white flowers in the spring. I had told her we'd figure it out when we got back from the first trip. We had said that about a lot of things. I sat in the driver's seat until the lot was fully dark. Then I locked the RV, went inside, and went to bed. The hearing was at 9 o'clock. Margaret had told me to arrive at 8:30. I had already set the alarm. The courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Millbrook County Courthouse smelled like old carpet and the particular kind of institutional silence that only exists in rooms where people have been afraid. I arrived at 8:27. Margaret was already at the table on the left side of the room, her briefcase open, 2 stacks of documents arranged in parallel with a precision I recognized from our first meeting 14 months ago. She had told me once that she organized her materials the same way every time, not from habit, but because predictability under pressure is a form of discipline. I believed her. I set my jacket on the chair beside her and sat down. The table was a pale oak veneer, scratched along one edge in a long diagonal line that someone had tried to cover with a felt pad. I noticed it the way I notice things I have no reason to notice the way you do when you're waiting and your mind needs somewhere to go. Brianna and Daniel arrived at 8:41. I know the time because I was watching the clock on the wall above the gallery, an analog clock with a second hand that moved in small, deliberate ticks. Brianna walked in first. She was wearing a dark navy blazer and had her hair pulled back in a way that I had never seen her wear it before, pulled tight, formal, deliberate. She carried a binder that was at least 2 inches thick and set it on the right-hand table with both hands, as if placing a cornerstone. Her attorney, a man named Ellsworth, who had been practicing family law in this county for roughly a decade, followed her in and took his seat without looking at our table. Daniel came in last. He sat down beside Brianna and did not look in my direction. He had not looked at me directly since the morning in the driveway, 3 weeks ago. I did not look away from him. I wanted him to know I was there. The gallery had 7 people in it. A young woman in the second row had a notepad open. She was from the local paper, the Millbrook Courier, a reporter I had seen once before at a zoning meeting 6 years ago. Two men in their mid-20s sat near the back with identical yellow legal pads, both uncapped pens resting on the bench beside them law students. From the look of it, probably from Whitmore College's clinical program. And in the far left corner of the gallery, in the aisle seat of the last row, sat Walt Deering. He was wearing the same brown canvas jacket he wore every morning when he walked his dog past my driveway. I had not called him. I had not asked him to come. He caught my eye when I turned and gave me a single, slow nod, the way you nod at someone when words would be the wrong thing. Judge Patricia Holloway entered at 9 o'clock exactly. The clerk called the room to order, and everyone stood. She was a compact woman in her early 60s, with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead and the particular economy of movement that comes from 22 years on the bench. She sat, opened the folder in front of her, and read for approximately 45 seconds without speaking. The room held its breath. Margaret presented for 40 minutes. I had watched her prepare this presentation across 4 meetings and 2 phone calls, and I had seen every document she placed before the court, but hearing it read aloud in sequence in that room, in that silence, was something different. She began with the financial history, 12 years of account records, every transaction, every withdrawal, every quarterly statement. The pattern was what she called it. Not a single anomaly in 12 years. Not one irregular transfer. Not one unexplained withdrawal. Not one decision that deviated from the documented financial behavior of a man who had spent 31 years as a licensed civil engineer managing project budgets in the millions. The RV purchase $74,000 represented 11% of my liquid assets. Margaret let that number sit in the air for a moment before moving on. She presented the certification from Dr. David Ung, who had been my physician for 9 years. He had conducted a full cognitive assessment 6 weeks before the hearing at Margaret's request. The assessment was 12 pages. His conclusion was 2 sentences. Margaret read them aloud. Judge Holloway wrote something down. Then Margaret called the account of Walt Deering. He had provided a written statement, notarized, describing what he had observed on the morning of March 14th. He had been walking his dog, a beagle named Copper, along the sidewalk in front of my property at 7:52 in the morning. He had seen a gray Honda Accord park at the curb in front of my house. He had seen the driver, a man he recognized as my son, whom he had met at a cookout at my house 4 years prior, sit in the car for approximately 20 minutes before getting out. He had seen the man enter the house using a key. He had seen the RV leave the driveway 40 minutes later. He had noted the time because Copper had a veterinary appointment at 9 and he was watching the clock. Margaret set the statement down and looked at Ellsworth. She said, "The petitioner claims this action was taken out of concern for Mr. Kowalski's well-being. The evidence shows the respondent's son waited 20 minutes in a parked car before entering. We would ask the court to consider what kind of welfare check begins with 20 minutes of observation from a parked vehicle." Ellsworth stood. He was measured in his delivery. I will give him that. He argued that the purchase of a recreational vehicle in the 14 months following the death of a spouse of 41 years constituted, in his phrasing, an emotionally driven financial decision inconsistent with the respondent's prior behavioral patterns. He said the word grief twice. He said vulnerability once. He said that the court should consider the totality of the circumstances. Judge Holloway had been looking at the document in front of her while he spoke. When he finished, she looked up. She took her reading glasses off her forehead and held them in her left hand. She said, "Counselor, are you telling this court that grief is evidence of incapacity?" Ellsworth opened his mouth. He did not immediately produce a sentence. Judge Holloway did not wait for one. She looked back down at her papers and made a second notation. The room was very quiet. The reporter in the second row had stopped writing. One of the law students had put his pen down. Judge Holloway read her ruling from the bench. She denied the petition for conservatorship in full. She found that the evidence presented by the respondent demonstrated consistent, documented, rational financial management over a sustained period of time, and that the petitioners had failed to meet the legal threshold required to establish incapacity. She said the word failed without emphasis, which made it land harder than if she had. Then she said something I had not expected. She looked up from the document and addressed the room rather than either table. She said that the evidence presented to the court that morning reflected a pattern of behavior by the petitioners that this court finds deeply concerning. She said it slowly, in the same tone she had used for everything else, which was the tone of a woman who understood that measured language in a courtroom carries more weight than raised voices. She then directed Margaret to file a separate motion regarding the events of March 14th so that the court could review those facts independently. Brianna did not move. She sat with both hands flat on the table, looking at a point somewhere above the judge's bench. Her binder was still closed. Daniel looked down at the table in front of him. I watched his jaw tighten once, then release. Across the room, Daniel looked up. It was brief a second, maybe less, and then his eyes found mine. I don't know what he was looking for. I held his gaze. He looked back down at the table. The clerk called the room to order for the adjournment. Everyone stood. The reporter from the Millbrook Courier, the young woman from the second row, closed her notepad, picked up her bag, and walked toward the right-hand table. She stopped beside Brianna and said, in a voice that carried clearly in the emptying room, "Ms. Kowalski, I'm with the Millbrook Courier. I was hoping to get a comment on the ruling." Brianna turned her head. She looked at the reporter the way a person looks at something they had not accounted for. "I have no comment," she said. The reporter said, "The judge mentioned a pattern of behavior she found concerning. Is there anything you'd like to say about that characterization?" Brianna stood, picked up her binder, and said, "I have no comment." Again. She said it more quietly the second time. She walked toward the door without looking at Ellsworth, without looking at Daniel, without looking at anyone. The binder was under her arm. She had carried it in with both hands, like a cornerstone. She carried it out like something she wanted to put down. Ellsworth followed her. He did not look at our table. Daniel was still in the room. He was standing in the far corner near the window, alone, his hands at his sides. When people began to move, Walt Deering came through the low gate that separated the gallery from the floor. He walked to where I was standing and held out his hand. I shook it. He nodded once, the same slow nod as before, and did not say a word. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was more. Margaret was gathering her documents. She aligned the stacks with the same precision as when she had set them out, working from right to left. She said, without looking up, "I've waited 28 years to hear a judge say that from the bench." She said it quietly, almost to herself. I told her I was glad it was this case. She looked up at that, and for a moment she smiled, brief, controlled, the smile of someone who does not spend it carelessly. I looked toward the right-hand table. Ellsworth was already packing his briefcase. Brianna had stood and was walking toward the door, her binder under her arm, without speaking to anyone. She did not look back. Daniel was still in the room. He was standing in the far corner near the window, alone, his hands at his sides. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not meant to go and was not certain how to leave. I looked at him for a long moment. He did not look up. Margaret touched my arm and said we should stop by the clerk's office before noon. I picked up my jacket from the chair, folded it over my arm, and followed her out. 3 weeks after the hearing, Margaret called me on a Tuesday morning while I was replacing a section of weather stripping on the RV's rear door. The seal had been loose since I bought it, something I'd noticed on the lot but hadn't gotten around to fixing. I had the door panel off and was working with a utility knife when my phone rang. I set the knife down and answered. She said Brianna's attorney had contacted her office. They wanted to discuss a settlement. I told her I was listening. The terms, as Margaret explained them over the next few minutes, were straightforward. Brianna and Daniel would withdraw the conservatorship petition with prejudice, meaning they could not refile on the same grounds. They would sign a written agreement acknowledging that Raymond Kowalski retained full legal authority over his own financial and personal affairs, and they would make no further legal claims relating to any asset currently titled in my name, including the RV, the house on Carver Street, and the investment accounts. In exchange, I would not pursue the criminal complaint Margaret had filed regarding the key incident, the one that established unauthorized entry and vehicle operation without consent. I asked Margaret what she thought. She said, "They know what the next filing looks like. If this goes back in front of Judge Holloway, it won't just be a dismissed petition, it'll be sanctions, possible referral to the state bar for Ellsworth, and a civil judgment for damages. They're not walking away from a fight, they're running from one." I told her to draw up the papers. She said, "Raymond, you're not happy about this." I told her that wasn't the word I'd use. I told her I'd sign the agreement because it was the correct thing to do and because Elaine would have told me the same. I didn't need a second round in that courtroom. I needed to be done. The settlement documents arrived by courier 4 days later. I read every page old habit from 30 years of reading construction contracts and signed on the last line of the last page. I left the notarized copies on my kitchen table for Margaret to collect. Then I went back to the RV and finished the weather stripping. The coffee shop where I met Daniel was on Meridian, half a block from the civil engineering firm where I'd worked for 11 years before I retired. The place had changed ownership twice in that time, but they still had the same corner booth by the window and the same parking situation, 3 spots, always full. I walked from the lot across the street. Daniel was already there when I arrived. He was sitting with both hands around a mug, not drinking. He looked like he hadn't slept well in some time. He was wearing a gray jacket I didn't recognize, and he'd lost weight. I sat down across from him and ordered a coffee from the server, a young woman who didn't linger. He looked at his hands for a moment and then said, "I didn't know she'd been planning it that long." I didn't answer right away. I've found that when people say something like that, they usually have more to say if you give them room. Daniel had more. He said he hadn't known about the conservatorship filing until 2 days before it was submitted. He said Brianna had been talking to Ellsworth for months since before the hearing about the RV, possibly since before that. He said he thought they were just protecting themselves legally, whatever that meant. He said he'd believed her when she told him I wasn't managing things well. He said he'd believed a lot of things. Then he said something I had not expected. He said that 2 weeks after the hearing, Brianna had received a call from Ellsworth's office. The state bar had opened a preliminary review of his conduct in the case Judge Holloway's referral, the one she had directed from the bench. Ellsworth had dropped Brianna as a client the same afternoon. Daniel said she had not taken that well. He said she had moved out of the house on Carver Street at the end of the previous month. He said it without drama. Looking at the table, he said they were working through the details. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Now, you know." He nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the parking lot and didn't say anything for a while. The Millbrook Courier had run a short piece the week after the hearing. I had read it once and put it in the folder. It was 4 paragraphs, a summary of the ruling, a quote from Judge Holloway's bench statement about the pattern of behavior she had found concerning, and a note that the respondent had declined to comment. Brianna's name appeared twice. The headline was "County Judge Denies Guardianship Petition, Cites Petitioner Conduct." It was not a long article. It didn't need to be. I didn't mention the article to Daniel. He had almost certainly seen it. In a county of this size, most people had. I didn't ask him about Brianna. I didn't ask what their marriage looked like now, or what he planned to do. Those weren't my questions to ask. He was 41 years old. He had made choices, and he would live inside them, the same way everyone does. When the server came back, I paid for both coffees. Daniel started to say something, and I told him it was fine. I put on my jacket and told him to take care of himself. He said my name as I stood just "Dad" quietly, the way a person says a word when they're not sure if they have the right to say it. I looked at him for a moment. Then I walked out. I met with Margaret one more time that October in her office on the 4th floor of the Aldrich building. She had the updated estate documents ready, the new will, the trust instrument, and the transfer on death designations for the accounts. We went through them page by page. She had been careful and thorough, the way she always was, and there was nothing I needed to change. The primary beneficiary of the revocable trust was the Elaine Kowalski Memorial Fund, designated for distribution to two organizations Elaine had supported for most of our marriage, a literacy program in the county school district, and a hospice care nonprofit in the next town over. I had called both organizations in September. They had both been gracious and careful on the phone, the way nonprofits are when someone mentions a bequest, and I had told them simply that my wife had believed in what they did, and that I wanted her name to mean something after she was gone. Daniel remained in the will. His share was not what it had been. The original document had designated 40% of the estate to him directly. The revised instrument designated 15%, the remainder redirected to the Elaine Kowalski Memorial Fund. I had not arrived at that number arbitrarily. I had thought about it for 3 weeks. The way I used to think about load calculations, working backward from what the structure needed to hold. 15% was enough to mean something. It was not enough to mean what he had been counting on. I didn't explain that decision to him, and I didn't plan to. The document spoke clearly enough on its own. Margaret signed as a witness, and her assistant, a quiet man named Vincent, who had been with the firm for 6 years, signed as the second. Patricia handed me my copy in a manila envelope with the firm's return address printed in the corner. I thanked her. She said, "Elaine would be proud of how you handled this." I told her I appreciated that. I meant it. I left the Aldrich building at 11:30 and drove to the storage lot to check on the RV. I had been servicing it through September in preparation oil, coolant, tire pressure, propane, water system. The list was the same one I'd made the spring before Elaine died, when we were still talking about the trip as a thing that would happen. I had kept the list in the kitchen drawer for 14 months. I used it without changing a word. On a Saturday morning in the second week of September, I pulled the RV out of the storage lot at 6:45. The sky was clear and the temperature was in the low 60s. I had packed the night before clothes, food for 4 days. The road atlas Elaine had bought at a truck stop in 2019 and annotated in the margins with her own handwriting. Small notes, distances, names of diners she'd read about somewhere. I stopped at the Sunoco on Route 9, the same station where Elaine and I had filled up every time we drove south toward the coast for 20 years or more. The pumps were the same layout, though they'd repainted the canopy at some point. A woman at the register, her name tag said Della, looked out at the RV while I was paying and said, "That's a beautiful rig. Where are you headed?" I told her the coast. She smiled and said to have a good trip. I told her I intended to. I drove south for 4 hours, stopping once for fuel and once to walk around a rest area for 10 minutes because my back stiffens if I sit too long. The roads were familiar for the first 2 hours and then less so, which was fine. That was the point. The campground where I stopped for the first night was called Harrow Bay, a small, quiet facility on a bluff above a tidal inlet. I had found it in Elaine's atlas. She had circled it in blue pen and written 2 words beside it, "Good View." I didn't know when she'd written that or how she'd known. I didn't need to know. I leveled the RV and connected the hookups as the light was going flat over the water. There were 3 other rigs in the campground, none of them close. I could hear the inlet, but not see it, yet the trees were still thick on the bluff's edge. I opened the glove compartment. The folded brochure was there where I'd left it, the coastal highway itinerary from the travel center in Denton, the one Elaine had picked up herself, and dog-eared on page 4. I had put it there the morning I left, before I pulled out of the driveway. I took it out and set it on the dashboard, open to the page she'd marked. I made coffee on the small burner, the same brand Elaine had always bought, the one in the red can, and carried the mug to the front seat. The windshield faced west, toward the inlet and the last of the light. I sat there while the sky went from orange to gray to the particular dark blue that comes just before full night, when you can still see the water, but the horizon has gone soft. I drank the coffee. I didn't read anything. I didn't make any calls. The brochure sat on the dashboard with Elaine's fold marks still sharp in the paper, the way they stay sharp for years in a thing that's been handled carefully and put away and kept. I didn't move it. I left it there for the morning. If you've ever sat quietly with something that belonged to someone you loved, not because you needed it to do anything, just because it still held the shape of their hands, you already understand everything this story was really about. If stories like this one find you when you need them, subscribe, and I'll keep them coming.